know. I feel like there should be some hot lights.
Thingy on, in case you can't hear me, Corey. It is 7:30, and that's our advertised time of start. So I will bring the special meeting of council for Thursday, June 26, 2014 at 7:30 to order. Looking for approval of our agenda.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. We have here Corey Vanderhorst through MNP, and he's here to go through and do a presentation. So, Corey.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hello, everyone. I've got a presentation. I've been told I have 7 minutes, so I'll go through it fairly quickly.
Being generous.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you through a few areas, some financial statement highlights. If you've got questions as we're going along, feel free to stop me and ask them. I'm flexible and happy to answer questions as we go. We'll talk about the audit report, the audit findings. I'll reconfirm our independence as an audit firm. And then I've got a few slides at the end that I'd like to put in of financial analysis, just kind of a different look at the city and how it's doing and how some of the activities have been trending in the finances for a few years. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a different perspective than just a bunch of these numbers on the page. So it just reminds you that the city's financial statements are prepared on a consolidated basis. So that means they've got 100% of the city's operations and capital, and there's also the 23% of the West Shore Parks and Rec Society's operations incorporated into these numbers. So sometimes you see things that look like, we'll see later on that recreation and culture expense looks, I think it's about the third highest, but a lot of that is driven by the West Shore numbers. So the statement of financial position, at December 31st, there is cash and investments of $15.3 million. Total financial assets, so cash and receivables and some other liquid assets, is $18.2 million. The debt on the books is just over $13.5 million, so that's short-term debt, long-term debt, and some capital leases. Just a little bit of different ways to structure some of those bits of debt. The total liabilities were $23.3 million. So when we subtract the liabilities from those financial assets, you get what we call the net debt, and that is just over $5 million. The tangible capital assets of the city are over $136 million. So there's a fair amount in there. And the accumulated surplus, I'll explain a little bit more what's in that number in a future slide, but it's almost $133 million of accumulated surplus. You can see most of that is represented by the tangible capital assets, but we'll get into a little bit of the detail there. The next page in your statements is the statement of operations. So that's what we would sometimes call the income statement if you were looking at a regular profit company. So total revenues in 2013 for the year were 19.8 million. That is an increase from the prior year, and it is below budget. Total expenses were 17.7 million. Again, another increase from 2012. But the nice thing here, expenses below budget. The annual surplus on an accounting basis is just over $2 million. So say it's on an accounting basis because that's not a cash basis. There's lots of accounting adjustments in there, things like amortization of assets, your debt payments don't show up in that number, your principal amounts. So I'll get into that when I look at the cash flows. Next two slides are going to look at revenues and expenses and just sort of seeing where the majority of them come from. If you like charts, they're a little bit easier to see sometimes. You can see there that most of the revenue for the last 2 years, 2012 is on the right, 2013 is on the left, is coming from taxes. And the next highest one is user charges, and you see in 2012 there was some other revenue, sort of one-time revenue that came in 2012 that didn't happen again in 2013. On the expense side of things, we can see that protective services is the largest expense, followed by engineering and transportation, and then you get down to recreation and cultural services being the third highest expense, and that's consistent year over year. The statement of cash flows is the next statement. I'm just going to summarize that at a really high level. So operations at the city brought in about $3.5 million. Capital purchasing, capital assets, physical assets was $1.3 million spent. There's another $400,000 of new assets that were brought in on capital leases. So we don't put them there as a cash out, but there is actually about $1.75 million of new assets, and $400,000 of that was financed with leases. Financing, there's $871,000 of cash flow out. That is paying down the debt on schedule. So at the end of or for the year 2013, there's a net cash inflow of $1.2 million. I promised I'd explain what's in accumulated surplus. You can see there what we call invested in capital assets is $122.9 million. That's the value of all the physical assets, things in the ground, buildings, minus the associated debt. And that's how we come up with that number. Reserves are $6.5 million, so money put aside for future projects, future capital, other items. And then the other, or sort of the unrestricted sitting there, is $3.3 million. So the total, again, $132.8 million. Are there any questions on the statements before I jump into the rest of it? I'm also happy to come back to the statements later if you'd like.
Just on your last slide, I was curious about the other, because I understood everything else except for that.
Sorry, I'm just moving to the note there. That's all the description that's given in the financial statements is other. I don't know if staff wants to further that explanation.
Well, this is just the total of our accumulated surplus, and what we do is we separate it out into how much we have invested in assets, how much is restricted to reserves, and the balance is what you might call your retained earnings.
Corey, in the composition of accumulated surplus in the capital assets, does that include any sort of assessment on the West Shore Parks and Rec, or is that just what the city has in buildings and things?
The West Shore numbers come in on another line, so I don't believe that includes West Shore. But I will defer to staff to clarify my understanding.
Yes, we would include the figures that you're seeing today are consolidated with West Shore. So if there is an investment in capital assets for West Shore, they would be included in that first figure, $122 million.
And just a question for you. Anything in there that stands out for you as unusual for a municipality of our size?
That's a good question. Thank you. The net debt would be my biggest concern, and that has been coming down and improving. See that when I get into some of the analysis later on, that it's been improving steadily. That would be my biggest concern, because what that number means is you're taxing in the future to pay for past costs, right, at a very high level. That's the biggest concern. Otherwise, from what I'm seeing in the numbers, for the size of the community, I don't see any red flags on the where the numbers are sitting.
And just on that, I had a question. Is not the majority of that debt for sewer infrastructure?
I'd have to defer to staff on that. I don't believe the notes or the information.
Yes, the majority of that debt is for sewer. I believe it's about $5.3 million. The balance of that is outstanding Triangle Mountain, Knob Hill, and Bear Mountain debt.
The arena?
Councilor Martin?
Thank you. I got two questions. Just so with the 13.5 million debt and 871,000 being paid back, I just did a rough calculation without calculating interest. We're looking about a 16-year rate if we take on no more debt. Am I correct in that, or am I missing something?
Yeah, I'd have to run those numbers, but your quick math. The other thing to consider is on with all debt that you've got, it's all MFA debt, so you have actuarial earnings on that, sinking fund earnings. So that accelerates the payments.
Right.
It may not be 16 years, maybe 14 or 15.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was doing the math right. And the second thing is the graph slide that you were working on expenses. Can we just get a quick definition of environmental health services and environmental and development services? I don't know what those mean.
I'll defer to staff for detail on that.
What color is that?
Sorry, it would be purple and blue. It's the fourth and fifth line.
The tiny little ones?
Yeah. So for example, the most expense was protective services, and then it was engineering, transportation. But then the third is environmental health services, and the fourth is environmental and developmental services. And I just don't know what those definitions are.
They're not the next.
They're this.
Oh, aren't they? I assumed that they went from.
That's recreation.
No, recreation is the next highest.
Okay, so they're not that cost, but I still don't know what they mean.
Yeah. Those particular ones will be like our emergency measures. We have certain programs in the city that I believe an environmental health service will include little pieces of engineering that have to do with that service. But primarily it have to do with emergency measure operations. It's very small.
Do you know what that is?
And sorry, and what about the environmental and development services?
The environmental and development services would be like planning.
Okay. And one last question. I'm assuming none of this there are no solar Colwood figures in these calculations at all, and they're the consolidated.
No, the Solar Colwood program operates on revenue matching expenditures, so it's kind of in and out. There might be about $8,000 in city expenses, which we agreed to as part of our NRCan agreement.
But we're not showing it as a budget or an audit when it comes to this.
Yeah, we would have to, because under our agreement with NRCan, we have agreed to cover all but the non-recoverable portion of our PST. So based on our 5-year plan for the Solar Colwood program, that works out to about $8,800 a year. Yeah. It's very minor, but it would be reflected in these numbers because it's a city cost.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anybody else? Carry on, Corey. Oh, did you have? Oh, sorry, Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you. I remember reading this report this morning, and I noted that the city isn't using an accrual method for capital assets. Is that the case, and can you tell me why?
It isn't using a what?
Yeah, you're too close to your.
Capital assets and accrual. And I read in the report that the city isn't accruing our capital assets.
It is. We'll get into
Yeah.
those items in a bit more detail, but the capital assets are being done on an accrual basis,
They are?
fully recorded, fully amortized,
Okay.
in accordance with city's policies. So I don't have any concerns about
And amortization? Is that?
amortization has been recorded.
It has.
Yes.
Okay, I must have misread that then. Thank you.
Okay, I will continue on with our audit report. We will be issuing an unqualified opinion, which means it's a clean audit opinion. We are satisfied that there are no material misstatements in the financial statements. We're ready to sign the report. Part of the process of an audit and signing off is we sign our audit report after council approval, so which would happen tonight. We're also completing some minor outstanding matters. Usually this says I'm waiting for legal confirmations, but I have those back and no concerns on that side. There are no contingencies showing up on those legal letters that you aren't already aware of, or city staff isn't already aware of. Our audit findings report, our audit responsibilities, we examine the controls at the city to make sure that there's accurate reporting of financial results. Specifically this year we looked at payroll and make sure that the payroll is being reported correctly. We gain an understanding of the controls in place. We don't necessarily test all the controls every year. That's not in the scope of an audit. We test the controls enough to give ourselves satisfaction that the numbers are being reported properly. If we don't test controls, we end up doing more work on the year-end balances. So a little bit of a give and take on an audit process. We sample transactions throughout the year to form our audit opinion. We don't look at every transaction. It's just not feasible for us. We'd have to have our own office right here in your building. So the audit is complete. We're ready to sign the report after council reviews and approves the statements. Materiality figure there is $300,000. So what that means is that any time that we found items and discussed them with staff, that's the level that we're using of whether an adjustment is needed or whether we can live with that as an unadjusted item. It also drives our audit testing. So we take that $300,000, we knock it down to $255,000, so we took down to 80% of the total, and that drives all our testing. So we look at every transaction, every balance over $255,000, and then underneath that amount, we test on a sample test. So that gives you comfort that we're looking at a minute level of detail compared to the overall transactions and overall balances of the city. During the audit, we discussed matters with the CAO, with the Director of Finance, with the Deputy Director of Finance, and several other staff in other departments, including planning, engineering, parking, things like that. We confirm our independence. MMP did not do any other work, any other projects for the city in 2013 and up to today's date that would impair our objectivity and our ability to give you an independent audit opinion. Are there any questions on those bits of the audit process before I get into some more financial statement analysis?
We're all good? Go ahead.
Great. So I'm going to take you through three areas that I'd like to look at. Sustainability, flexibility, and vulnerability. Give you an idea of how things have been trending for the last 3 to 5 years. So we start in sustainability, which is the degree to which the city can maintain its existing liabilities with respect to service commitments to the public, financial commitments to creditors, employees, without increasing debt or tax burden on the local economy. So the first one we look at is we take the total assets and compare that to the total liabilities. Here we're looking for a number greater than 1. Right? Again, this idea of you have enough assets there to pay for future costs or you're paying for past costs. So assets to liabilities is greater than 1. It's been consistently above 6. And what's causing that is that large number of tangible capital assets, physical assets, right? So you have more total assets than debt. But when we narrow it down into the financial assets or the liquid assets, again, we're looking at that ratio of trying to get to 1 if you're paying for the past or paying for the future. Financial assets to liabilities is below 1. It was 0.78 in 2013, but it's been steadily improving. It was as low as 0.46 in 2009, and it shows steady improvement every year. If you'd like the detail of all these years, I'd be happy to provide that to council through staff. But again, still in a net debt position, but good improvement and a good trend over the last 5 years, 4 years. Then we look at the net debt position, that $5 million net debt, and we compare it to the total annual revenue. So this is a rough estimate of the measure of future revenue that has to pay for past transactions and events. So this ratio, again, is steadily improving. In 2009, it was 92%. That meant 92% of the tax revenue was going towards past costs. It's now down to 25% in 2013. So that's a similar trend that we saw. And if we focus in on tax revenue rather than total revenue, it was 128% in 2009, and it's down to 37%. So there's a significant amount of revenue going towards debt payment of tax revenue, but the ratio there is getting better and better every year.
Sorry, can I interrupt you just for a moment?
Yeah.
And I'm not actually going to ask you a question, but can I ask councillors that were on council before 2000, what was the spending on that got your ratio that high? Do you guys know? Like, it can't just be about sewers, is it?
It was mostly about sewers.
That's how the ratio got up so high? Like, I'm sure you don't know. That's hence the reason I'm not directing it to you.
Well, then we had Bear Mountain Arena. We had the intersection constructed. We had some sidewalk work, Whale Road.
It's been a lot of capital investment.
Yeah.
So it was the capital.
Oh,
It
and
was.
Pat's jumping in.
Oh, Pat.
The leasing thing suddenly jumped to a new policy that
Yes.
was 100% unexpectedly, and then
Yes.
it was years later, but at the time it just hit us.
That's
Right.
right.
And the Lehigh reassessments,
Yeah.
before the mine permits were finished, were reassessed to residential, which dropped our revenue significantly.
And we had a couple of significant legal issues with Machosen.
Okay. So, and sorry, through the mayor, is that all right if I keep asking? Directed to either staff or to anybody who knows, and perhaps even you, Corey. Now that we've dropped that ratio down to 25%, are we at all at a risk of it going back up, other than us taking on new debt? I'm not, obviously that's a no-brainer, but is there somehow that we could lose control of that again? Is there something that's outstanding, a huge liability or anything that would push us, that the ratio would change significantly as it's now trending the proper way? So I'll look to whoever knows the answer to
I
that.
can start at a high level. I'm not aware of any major liabilities, and things that came up, like I talked about contingencies and things that would cause this problem. It's where you're going to see this is when you're budgeting and looking at capital and projects and things that are coming down the line and how you're funding it and whether you're funding it through debt or taxes, right? So any debt decision shifts this trend, reverses this trend, right? But again, you've got to look at the mix of where is your sweet spot for debt versus taxes, right? Because if you've got a $5 million capital project, there's probably not a lot of taxpayer appetite for that much of a tax increase, right? So again, that's where the budget decision comes into play.
And sorry, one final question, if I may. How has that number trended down? Has that number trended down because, and it might be a combination of both, is it because we've increased our taxation or have we decreased our liabilities? Well, that's what I mean by increasing taxes, would be an increase, yeah.
We significantly took a tax increase a few years back, and we have also been steadily repaying the debt. So, like, the main will be paid off this year, and then we have some more maturing in the next few years. So, while the tax percentage lift has gone up significantly, it has also been applied towards the debt. So, high taxes, but the debt has been going down.
Councillor Day?
Thank you. I was going to ask if this was common to have the higher debt ratio with younger municipalities as well, because some of the majority of the debt that we're paying off being for sewers, I think the amortization period for most of that debt is 15 years. Or as each phase came on, so they're at slightly different levels depending on when they began. Sewer infrastructure lasts usually in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 years. So I think in the case of sewer infrastructure, wouldn't it be normal that all residents who use that facility would contribute towards it? So like a younger municipality would have more debt, and it would be paid off through taxpayers for the next 50 years.
Yeah, not an uncommon thing to see a trend like this. To be honest, sometimes don't put this one in because communities are in a net financial asset position, not a net debt position. So they have more liquid assets available than debt, and they have money reside in the future, more than City of Colwood has. But what you just described, that mix of younger municipality that may have to put in a big new sewer project or a new water or something like that, you definitely see this type of scenario, right? Because all the debt, MFA or if you're doing some type of, there's all long term on that, right? And the life of the asset would definitely be longer than the debt life, right? So you get the current residents and future residents, or residents in the future paying for that and paying it off. I'll keep moving along, and I'll jump into flexibility. So this is the degree to which the city could change debt or tax burden on the local economy to meet your existing liability. In this one, I looked at public debt charges, which translated that is the interest you're paying on your debt. So current interest costs as a percentage of total revenue. This is a rough estimate of the constraint on your current resources that those interest costs are causing. So this ratio has been steady. The last 5 years has been between 2.6 and 3%. So 2013 is right on that 2.6 number. Again, that's not a high number. 2.6% of revenues are going towards interest payments. Next one we look at, and this often leads into an interesting discussion, is the net book value of physical assets comparing to the original cost. So this gives you a rough estimate of the useful lives available to provide services. So what we call the carrying value or the depreciated value of the tangible capital assets is around 75%. It's been slowly declining. It was 79% in 2009, just came down a couple percentage points each year. So this means there's declining value in some assets or older assets, right? And future cost of capital may be increasing. That number in the 70s is higher than some other communities that I work with. So that doesn't mean that you've got a large problem. You're not in the 50s or 60s and there's a ton of old assets and infrastructure that needs to get done, but it is out there. Any community in BC or Canada has old infrastructure, old assets that need to be addressed. This is kind of your first step towards the infrastructure deficit idea, right? What you would need to get infrastructure deficit is you would need to know replacement costs on the infrastructure and the assets, condition assessments, and the timelines of when those items would need to be replaced. And that would give you your idea or your number for what is the infrastructure deficit, right? There's $136 million of tangible capital assets there. So even if you had to replace it at current value, that's a lot. My guess, educated guess is that the replacement value would be much higher than that. I believe the actual cost, or the historic cost on that is somewhere around $180 million. So.
Corey, do you have an opinion of what the ideal number should be when a community is working at? Should it be about 80 or?
I haven't seen 80 in any community that I work in. Like I said, I've seen mid-50s to 79, 75. It does depend on the age of the community, the type of infrastructure you have. In terms of you may have a different setup here with Capital Region District than, let's say, the city of Nanaimo does with the Nanaimo Region District, and who's doing what services, right? Who's got sewer and water and things like that, and how is it being charged to residents, and what are you on the hook for? Well, I tend to focus more on the trend. What's it doing, right? And it's declining, right? So there aren't a lot of communities that I work with that have been able that are actually reversing that trend. It's hard to keep on top of that declining value in the assets, right? And I think this is either the last or the second to last ratio that we looked at. So this is vulnerability, really looking at provincial and federal government programs and funding and how vulnerable the city is. So this ratio of government transfers to total revenues, it fluctuates. 2013 and 2012 are around 11%. In the last 5 years, it was as low as 6.7%. High percentage years are when there's more capital grants, capital projects going on. We tend to see this swing up and down. Some communities get as high as 30% if they have a big project. You know, if they had a shovel-ready something from the infrastructure fund, got a bunch of money in. And I'm expecting to see in the next few years, as some of that infrastructure and funding comes online that was just announced last year, you might see an uptick again. But these numbers that are, low tens or down below means you're not highly reliant on other sources of funding, on government funding, and on the taps being turned on or turned off. But again, it does depend on what capital projects you've got coming up and whether there's other funding available for those.
So if you do get a large, say, infrastructure grant to build a new something, how does that affect that carrying value? So say we're sitting at our 75%, we used to be at 79, and we brought on a brand new, I don't know, wastewater treatment plant. How would that affect that carrying value?
Yeah, you'd see that number come up. The idea, or the only way to move that up a percentage or get an uptick is to have a big, newer asset that is higher value than your amortization for the year, right? I think amortization is about $2 million. Yeah, just over $2 million the last few years. So put a big asset on that's more than $2 million, see that ratio creep up a little. That's why it's my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions on anything else that was in there.
Anybody? Anything? Yes, no? Seeing none?
I like the way you broke down the presentation without the, it was kind of, audits for dummies, and I'm a dummy, so I appreciated it.
I was going to mention that too, actually. I was thinking about that earlier today. A number of these percentages, I don't think I've ever seen them in our audit report before. And it is very much more user-friendly from a layman's point of view, looking at the budget. I mean, I go through the budget every year carefully. Sadly, this time I went through electronically, made a whole bunch of notations, and then, as often seems to happen to me, there's a glitch in the program and I've lost all my notes. So then, well, did it really matter anyways? Because I'm kind of nitpicking, looking for specifics as I go through anyways. These percentages that you're pointing out are more probably valuable than many of the things that I'm able to draw out of the figures on my own.
Thank you. Yeah, sometimes it's nice to be able to step out of some of the details and see some trends and some bigger picture things.
It might be unfair for me to ask you this, but I will anyway, and just tell me if it is unfair. With respect to the net debt, are you aware of any strategies municipalities have used to try to reduce that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's that's so intrinsically tied to your budgeting and what you're deciding to do with tax rates, and paying down debt. You've got money set aside in reserves. It needs to be there for some of the projects and things that you've got coming along the line. So I would never recommend somebody to start stripping out reserves because it's just not a sustainable practice. But finding other sources of revenue is always that sort of tough area, and things that you've got constraints as a municipality of what you can and can't generate. Or you're kind of limited to tax and a couple other user fee areas. I haven't seen that great idea of how to get rid of it fast. If you end up with a little bit of excess cash for whatever reason, something doesn't happen, if you don't decide to roll it into some program or project, pay down some debt a little bit faster, depending on what you have. But again, I haven't seen that very often.
Okay, thank you.
There tends to be a decision at the communities I work with to continue spreading the cost out rather than to hit community all in 1 year heavily with things. Just that's a hard thing to do, right?
Anyone else? No, that's good.
I do just have one other question. And it's with respect to the carrying value of capital assets as being around 75%. And you talked about three things: replacement costs, the condition of the assets, and then timelines to replace. And you said historical costs are about 180 million. Was that an example directly reference to the city of Colwood, or where did that come from?
Yes, that is directly related to the city of Colwood. The historical cost of your capital assets is $183 million. And the appreciated value is $136 million.
Right.
Hence the reason it's 75%.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
And it does also include West Shore Parks and Rec.
Yes. Yeah, West Shore is 15 million of cost, just under 12 of net book value.
Okay. And then, of course, the replacement costs are going to be much higher.
I would estimate that if you're looking at 180 on historical costs, some of these things have been going in for a long time. I mean, we're going back decades for some of these assets. It's going to be, well over 200,000, for replacement costs, just with the way construction prices move. Some of the items, some of the assets, I'm sure, are 50, 60, 70 years old, depending on what it is.
You mean 200 million?
Yeah, 200 million.
Oh, okay, thank you. And with respect to the timelines, do we have any idea of what those timelines look like?
That would be a question for engineering. That's sort of part of, if you get into that fully fledged asset management plan, I would refer to staff if there's any projects in the works or if they have that information already.
Okay, over to staff. Do we have an asset management plan in the works? Do we have one?
No, we do not. I know that there are some discussions in the works about putting a citywide asset management plan together. I believe that the city actually owns a software program that went back when Adia was here, that was implemented. Unfortunately, nobody knew how to use it, and she went on maternity leave. In that program is all of our city assets and what the projected replacement cost is as at 2011 year end. Ideally, we would take what we have and bring it up to 2013 and use that program to help us project what our long-term plan would be. But there are some discussions going around about sorting out just beyond our fleet. We have lots of other assets, the buildings, that we need to look at the long-term replacement for. And currently, those are not in any plan or in the current budget.
That was going to be my next question. Have we set aside any contingency for asset management at all? It doesn't sound like we have, but it sounds like there's pretty significant liability there at some point in time, and we don't know what that point in time is. So I think as council, we should probably keep our eye to that as we move forward. I think it's really important that we take some leadership and responsibility for managing our capital assets, because I'd hate to see any council be faced with a significant tax increase to deal with this issue, as well as any unfunded liabilities we may have. So I think, next year in our budget cycle, it might be a little bit of different conversation. At least I would hope.
And we do actually have some money that is per council resolution from 2012. I know it was before my time, but I'm pretty sure it started in 2012. We put $50,000 per year into the Capital City Center Fire Hall building. We put $50,000 each year into infrastructure deficit reserve, and we put $175,000 a year into just general capital. And so while that isn't a significant amount of money, it's in the right direction. And if you think about having to finance $200 million worth of asset, what the annual servicing cost on that debt would be, we're not quite there yet if we wanted to pull those payments out of reserve each year to offset the impact on the taxpayer. But so it's a yes and no. We've started it with council's direction, but we're not quite at the ideal.
Corey, what's the amortization expense for this year for our assets?
I believe it's just over $2 million. I think it's been fairly consistent the last 2 years. Sorry, I'll just, 2.48 last year and 2.036.
So based on what we're putting away each year for these reserves is insignificant to what's actually required.
Yeah, it's not common for communities, or the communities that I work with don't, they call fund amortization, don't put $2 million aside to keep it funded. And if you look at the increase in reserves last year, it's about $500,000. And it goes into a bunch of reserves, as Rebecca mentioned, lots of other things there.
Right, but in 2011, our reserve balance was only $4 million. So in just a couple years, it has improved significantly. And if you go back a little further, there wasn't even much there at all prior to that. So steadily improving. But the variance between 2012 and 2013 is a little misleading because we put money into the reserve, but we're also taking money out at the same time to fund capital acquisitions or projects have been carried forward into the following year. So the net increase might look not significant, but there's a lot more going in and a lot more coming out in that net change.
Good. All right, Corey.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
And thank you very much. That was really helpful.
Need to receive his report.
Yeah, I think, what do we? Were there any questions on any of the detail that was in behind by anybody?
I had one question that I remember from my notes that are gone. I had carefully made notes on my agenda, and when the agenda was changed, they're gone, unfortunately. But one of my questions was around the unfunded liability for the pension plan. And I thought that because we were with the municipal pension plan, that the unfunded liability lay strictly with the pension plan itself. since we make our employer portion. And there were some comments about that. I just wondered if there was any clarification that staff or maybe Corey could give me on that.
Yeah, that's not a city responsibility. That's the pension plan's responsibility. It's a significant deficit. It's a lot of money, but that is a pension plan issue.
Yeah, I can't say any better than that. This is not on your books, but that, because they had a recent valuation, end of 2012, and that number jumped a lot. That 1.37 billion is pretty significant.
Anybody else? That's good. So then,
No.
pardon?
I was just wondering what some of our other significant unfunded liabilities are. I remember last year in our budget cycle, we were talking about vacation liability, unused vacation liability, sick leave liability, and I just don't have a sense of where we're at with that.
Mm-hmm.
And any other significant material unfunded liabilities.
Yeah, the city does set aside funding. If you look under Note 5 of the financial statements, specifically, we have an accrued sick leave payable bank and a retirement and or also known as severance payable upon retirement bank. The city's practice at this point is to fund that at about 63% of the liability. So the funds are there, and as it's a complicated calculation, but it projects how many people you expect to add to it. You look at trends of how many people carry forward their sick leave each year. So it's a very detailed calculation. And then we take into account who we expect to leave that pool. So it's always fluctuating to take into account our current workforce, how old they are, how often they're here, how often they're not, and when we expect them to retire.
That's great, thank you. And is 63% standard practice across municipalities?
From what I understand, it is. It's an amount that's audited every year, and it has not been raised to me that it's insufficient.
Thank you.
Thank you. And on page 47 of the agenda, under the accumulated surplus, there's a line item for St. John's Church, and the balance is listed as $35,351. And I thought that the balance should have been in the neighborhood of $50,000. So I was just wondering about that item.
Yes, if council will recall that last year we had a 100-year centennial, and some of the costs for that centennial were specifically targeted to be paid for out of the St. John Reserve.
What's that?
15 grand of it, though?
Yeah.
There was a grant.
The reserve fund was just established early part of 2013. The opening balance of that account was $40,000, and we took $5,000 out for the centennial, and our calculation for what gets added to the reserve in 2014 we can only do after we have audited financial statements. So you're probably thinking about what the net profit was to go into the reserve. So now that we do have audited statements, we can make that calculation, but we can't do it in advance because we don't know what the numbers are going to end up to be.
Okay. So the income from the past year is about to go into that account then?
Yeah, the income for 2013 has not been put into the account yet.
Thank you. That explains it.
Too bad we didn't know that at our meeting.
Anything else? So we need a motion then to receive or to pardon? Motion to approve?
Does Corey need to sign off?
Yeah, we received my report and approved
The 2013 audited financial statement, because they could be any financial statement.
Motion to receive.
Second.
That we have to do two.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried.
Just so I'm clear, the motion was to receive the auditor's report, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So I will move that we approve the audited financial statements.
Can I just expand on that? That the 2013 audited consolidated financial statements be approved as presented by Corey Vanderhorst of MNP LLP at the June 26, 2014 special meeting of council.
Well, see, you've got it already all written down.
It's like she can read my mind.
Seconder, please.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Public participation, seeing that we have none. So, motion to move in camera. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried.
Shut the door and we'll stay here?
Yep.
The door and we'll stay here?
I guess we can just close the door and
I can get that. And Scooters as well.
do we need James for anything more for tonight?
I like the way you look.
It's a lot better in jeans, eh?
I know he was